Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and I'd like to welcome my esteemed panelists up here. I'm excited and honored that together with these panelists, we will be able to conduct the first panel discussion here at this ACPC. This format of a conference has been bringing people together from all corners of the world before the pandemic for discussions and exchanges, which are so important, especially in the world of political communication. Now that we see light at the end of the tunnel in handling the pandemic, we also see some political consequences. And I'd like to welcome with me here up on the stage John Neri from the Philippines. Mahfuz Anam from Bangladesh. Stephanie Bolton from Germany. Actually with us should be Professor Jean-Pierre Cabestan. A round of applause for him as well, and I'm very optimistic that we are here. He is. Welcome, Professor Cabestan. I mentioned that I think we are coming to an end of the pandemic, and the Honorable Abbot in his very interesting presentation already mentioned that. But I think during the pandemic we also made a shocking realization that people with easy answers to difficult questions obviously gained support. There were people like Duterte in the Philippines, Bolsonaro in Brazil, or Vladimir Putin in Russia. And it almost seemed that the ignorance, which was mentioned earlier on as well, of Donald Trump towards COVID-19 boosted his popularity, at least amongst his supporters. We are going to discuss the characteristics and the ways how to deal with political strongmen. Now, what is a political strongman? And a brief look into the Collins Dictionary already hints that in different parts of the world, and our host Ansgar Graf mentioned from how many countries and continents we come from at this conference on political communication, there seem to be slightly different definitions or meanings or connotations when it comes to defining the meaning of a political strongman. The one explanation is, if you refer to a male political leader as a strongman, you mean that he has great power and control over his country, although his methods may sometimes be violent or morally wrong. Whereas another definition, also in the Collins Dictionary, says a strongman is somebody who rules a country with absolute power. A strongman is a dictator. Strongmen, let me underline that, are not only a phenomenon of one particular region or continent. And I think the pandemic in particular and the events since the February 24th attack of Russia against Ukraine have already shown that this is a worldwide phenomenon. Ruth Ban-Giert from New York lists in her book Strongmen how illiberal leaders consolidate power and how they can be defeated as possible examples of strongmen, the likes as Idi Amin, Benito Mussolini, Silvio Berlusconi, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Rodrigo Duterte, and Vladimir Putin. And then she goes on by saying that a certain kind of masculinity seems to be characteristic for these leaders, that they seem to radiate a certain kind of charisma that in return delivers political disaster. I sometimes wonder, going back in history, how can we as people who are politically interested, politically active, as media people, how can we sometimes go so wrong? And I think we have to ask ourselves that critically. When Vladimir Putin took over from Boris Yeltsin, many observers in the West, and many citizens in Russia, by the way, were quite content that here comes somebody who brings law and order, who brings an end to the chaos of those years after the end of the Soviet Union. When Putin delivered his speech in the German Bundestag about a new chapter in German-Russian relations, many observers in politics and in media and in public believed the former KGB spy. When Recep Erdogan took over in Turkey, I remember a front page story of The Economist magazine which said that this man can bring together, he can reconcile Islam and democracy. Well, I think The Economist magazine wouldn't make that as a front story anymore. When the Saudi crown prince took power or took charge, many observers in the West thought that he is the savior of Saudi Arabia, the savior of Saudi Arabian women, that he would pull Saudi Arabia out of the dark ages and into modernity. Isn't the danger, very often I ask myself, that we as outsiders and as observers like to see something in these people that they've never said, let alone thought? Bearing all that in mind, I do look forward to our exchange of opinions, to our insights in this discussion from some of the leading experts on the characteristics of these strongmen and on the questions that you, the audience, will then later pose and engage with us. We now welcome each of our speakers. Each of you will share his and her thoughts for not more than 10 minutes, please, and then we will have a discussion amongst us and with the audience. And I'd like to hand over by welcoming once again Professor Jean-Pierre Cabestan of the Hong Kong Baptist University. Over to you, Professor.
Well, thank you for inviting me to this roundtable. I'm sorry not to be able to come to Singapore because I have a heavy teaching load in spite of being retired now. But I will say a few things about, well, my own subject of interest, which is China, and which is, of course, led by, for more than 10 years now, by Xi Jinping. He's a kind of a man of the day because in 4 days from now, the 20th Party Congress of the Chinese Communist Party is going to open, and he will make a long speech. And at the end of the week of the Party Congress, he's going to be very probably reappointed or re-elected Party Supremo, so the General Secretary of the party. He may even get a new title. According to propaganda outlets you may see in China, he is now named the leader of the people, 人民领袖 in Chinese, and that's maybe another title we'll get at the end of the Congress. So clearly today, China is led by a strongman which has many characteristics and very specific characteristics because of his past. He belongs to the Communist Party high official family. He had some difficulties during the Cultural Revolution and the Mao, but he came back quite early after the beginning of the reforms era and managed to get important positions in some key Chinese provinces before being selected as a successor to Hu Jintao. Now, I have to say that in 2012, when he took over, the party was in crisis. The Communist Party of China was in crisis because of the Bo Xilai affair, the major corruption case, plus a murder. The leadership was weak and fragmented, and there was a real need for centralization. And that's exactly what he did. And I have to say there was much support within the party to help him accumulate power and re-centralize the whole party organization. So the party itself is a huge machinery. It's a huge family, if you will, with 96 million members, so 7% of the Chinese population now. But it's also a very, well, it's led in these characteristics. It's a very centralized organization. China is a huge country. Provincial powers, provincial leaders are quite autonomous. They enjoy a lot of leeway. And so whilst Xi Jinping has been able to centralize power at the center, it's maybe less the case outside of Beijing, in particular in faraway provinces, depending on the provinces, of course. Now, the question is whether, why, apart from the need to centralize power, has he centralized so much power himself? I think he has an obsession which is very specific to China, which is the demise of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and in his view, is because of a lack of ideology. So that's why he has revived the Marxist-Leninist ideology. So now we have someone at the top of China who is, from a political point of view, a Leninist, and from an economic point of view, a Marxist. Meaning by that, he wants to promote and protect the public companies, the state sector of the economy, to the detriment of the private sector. And so in the last few years, he has set up party committees with a number of large private companies, and he wants to keep private businesses on a leash, and a shorter leash than before. And that may be one of the challenges he will face down the road as China is witnessing, as the rest of the world, a slowdown of its economy, and maybe next year a recession. Now, a recession and economic difficulties may be an additional reason for China to rely on a strong man. And a lot of people in China may think that actually a strong man is like Xi Jinping is the man we need. And I think exactly what the propaganda apparatus of the Chinese Communist Party is going to build in the coming days, with the party congress, to sort of justify that we need a strong man, and we need to go away with two principles which were introduced by Deng Xiaoping at the beginning of the reform era, a return to collective leadership in order to avoid the vagaries of having a very powerful, health man at the top of the party, like Mao Zedong, who provoked a number of catastrophes, including the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. So collective leadership was perceived by Deng Xiaoping and the reformists of the party as the best way, the best, mechanism to prevent a return to a strong man and a kind of a tyrannical dictatorship. So he has gone away to some extent with that, and that's an issue. And I think some people in China are concerned about it. The second principle he has revised is the principle of not promoting personality cult, 个人崇拜 in Chinese, and that's by the way enshrined in the party constitution. But you can see that today the cult of Xi Jinping's personality has been booming everywhere. Now his thought himself is going to be put on par with Mao Zedong's thought in the coming days, and clearly it shows that the party and himself feel that they need. China is going to walk in to navigate in more rough seas. That we need a strong health man at the top of the party. The question, of course, is whether all those mechanisms and those recipes will help China to continue its unprecedented economic development and the quest for power. And here I have some questions, actually. First of all, I think within China, we sometimes underestimate the fact that there is some opposition to some of the changes Xi Jinping has introduced in the political system, like the revision of the constitution of the state, which he forced upon in 2018. So now he can remain head of state, president of the republic, as long as he wishes. By the way, I have to indicate here that in the party constitution, there are no term limits for any senior position within the party. You can be a Politburo member for life. You can be a general secretary of the party for life if you want to, or if the party leadership accepts it. Now, this revision of the constitution has not gone down well among the elites, and I think China's elites are divided about how well funded that decision has been. Now, the other thing is he has reintroduced Marxist and Leninist education in China altogether, but it's still in the party among the elite, and that's something which seems to be more and more out of step with the changes within the Chinese society. I think the younger people in China, including my students, when I ask them what do they know about Marxism and Leninism, the answer is usually very short. They just believe that, China is implementing Marxism-Leninism with Chinese characteristics, but they can't go further than that. So clearly there is a big gap between what the party is professing in terms of ideology, a credo, and what the people believe in China. That's the reason why, and I will finish on that, Xi Jinping has tried to blend Marxism-Leninism with a return to Confucianist ideology, which is much better understood by most Chinese, be they living in mainland China, in Hong Kong, or elsewhere in another Chinese society. So that's where we are now. But you can see already within the strongman policy, politics of China, a number of tensions, which maybe will become obstacle to China, to Xi Jinping's rule in the coming years. So to some extent, China's Xi Jinping's power has reached a peak as we speak today. And I believe that the next 5 years will be maybe more challenging to him than the past 5 years, as China's economy is slowing down. There is maybe more frustration in society. There will be more social disputes and unrest to manage, and also more tensions with the United States. And then here, which another issue which may be also dividing with the party leadership, which is how far should we go as far as China is concerned in China's confrontation with the United States and with the West, in particular around Taiwan. And that's why I think we're reaching the limits of the strongman politics in China. But I think, of course, having said that, in the next few days, Xi Jinping has very high chances of being renewed in his position and remain the strong man of China for the next 5 years. I think I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kabestan. Can I just add one question? You said you're reaching. It seems that China is reaching the limit when it comes to the concept of a strong man. Is there ever a notion, as the political scientist whom I quoted earlier on said, that political strongmanism is a concept for disaster?
Well, at the beginning, and here I like your comparison with Putin, because at the beginning Putin was welcomed by a lot of Russians. And I can say that when Xi Jinping took over, launched this unprecedented campaign against corruption, he was welcomed by a lot of people. And even some observers within China, but also outside of China, of course, were pretty optimistic about, Xi Jinping being maybe a reformist and, accumulating power actually to sort of force reforms within the system. I think that was pretty wrong to believe that, and there was no indication actually from the outset that Xi Jinping was a reformist. Much more someone from the nomenclatura, and who with a plan to protect the nomenclatura's privileges and status within the Chinese political system. So that's my answer.
Thank you very much, Professor. And we would be glad if you can stay with us throughout the discussion. I hope you have time for that. You're welcome to do so. John Neri, closely associated with the magazine Rappler of Nobel Peace Laureate Maria Ressa. Over to you. And John has a presentation also.
Good morning. I understand my brief here as an opportunity to reflect on the Philippine experience with the return of political strongmen, and maybe I can suggest a provocative way of starting the discussion later. I have 4 points to make and 1 slide to share. First point, if the conference theme, the return of political strongmen, resonates with us in the Philippines today, it is only secondarily because the son and namesake of the dictator Ferdinand Marcos is now the new president. It is primarily because the brutal, foul-mouthed, chaotic Rodrigo Duterte paved the way for the return of the Marcoses. President Duterte figures in the rogues gallery in Ruth Ben-Ghiat's Strongmen, the book that helped redirect the spotlight to the term. Ben Giat's book has many arresting anecdotes, but suffers from the lack of a conceptual framework. Whichever way you define strongman, however, you can argue that Duterte meets the broad definition: illiberal, populist, violent, authoritarian, the evangelist of the macho gospel. Duterte created the conditions that ultimately allowed Ferdinand Marcos Jr. to become president. Second, relative to Philippine politics, the Philippine presidency is an extraordinarily powerful office. And for that reason, vulnerable to authoritarian or strongman temptations. Our first president, Emilio Aguinaldo, was a revolutionary general who won pride of place because of battlefield victories. Manuel Quezon was a naturally gifted politician who dominated Philippine politics for 3 decades. But it was the first Marcos who took full advantage of the presidency's vulnerability. He engineered the country's democratic collapse in 1972 and ran a military regime for 14 years. Third point, Marcos was a savvy politician who believed in the power of myths. Indeed, he benefited from reinvention himself. With his wife, he appropriated the Filipino creation story known as Malakas at Maganda, the strong and the beautiful, and turned it into one of the foundations of his so-called new society. Now, the Filipino creation myth has many versions, but the common elements include the following. The gods created a largely empty universe. A magical bird lighted on a bamboo grove and pecked away at one bamboo stalk, and the first man, Malakas, the strong, emerged. The bird pecked at another stalk, and the stalk split open, and out came Maganda, the beautiful. With the approval of the gods, the strong and the beautiful then populated the world. How did the conjugal dictatorship of Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos turn this story into a Marcos myth? Take a look. So this is a pair of paintings that was found inside Malacanang Palace after the Marcoses fled. To those of us who grew up during the Marcos regime, these images were very familiar to us. So the first man and the first woman, the strong and the beautiful, had been transformed into Ferdinand Marcos and his beautiful wife Imelda, the first couple of the Filipino race. Marcos had reinvented himself as a war hero with multiple medals, the leader of a guerrilla unit in World War II. This became the basis for his reputation as Malakas. In his official biography, published before his first presidential term in 1965, even his alleged survival under torture is minutely described, including an apparent episode of astral projection. And during the martial law regime, he oversaw a continuing campaign that portrayed him as a gifted and able sportsman, good in golf, the popularizer of the racket sport known as pelota. His capacity to deliver extemporaneous speeches for hours on end, a la Fidel Castro, was also used to reinforce the official portrayal of him as Malakas. Imelda, on the other hand, was a glamorous figure, a truly beautiful woman, the doyenne of special occasions, the patroness of the arts, who understood her role, and she said this herself, as precisely that of a star. Stars, by definition, are something or someone we all look up to. The celebrity, the unattainable ideal as maganda. Fourth point. In the Philippine setting today, the return of the strongmen comes with a twist. The signs of return are there, unfortunately, and they are mostly associated with Duterte, with his so-called diehard supporters, and now with his daughter, the incumbent Vice President, Sara Duterte. I mean, the overriding belief in candid, even brutally frank talk, military service as an article of faith, intimidation as the preferred form of interaction with critics, the weaponization of the rule of law, the readiness to use violence for political purposes. But the second President Marcos, we all call him Bongbong, is not too interested or too invested or at this point not yet fully implicated in these things. He enjoys the advantage of not having to worry about them, precisely because Duterte has paved the way. Just one example, he does not need to do like his father did and consider imposing military rule on the Philippines again, because Duterte has shown him how to wield power how to wield almost absolute power without needing to declare martial law. Political scientists call this democratic erosion. What is Bongbong Marcos known for then, 100 plus days into his 6-year term? His emphasis on unity, his natural inclination to depend on diplomacy, to shy away from direct conflict, his own tendency to look for a good time, like he did here a couple of weeks ago at the F1 race. His readiness to inhabit a role as celebrant-in-chief. This suggests that Philippine history does repeat itself. First as malakas, now as maganda. Thank you.
Thanks very much, John. I mean, these paintings remind me of the palaces of Mobutu Sese Seko in Zaire when you come in them, or when I visited palaces of Saddam Hussein in Iraq after he fell, you know, or we all recall the image of Vladimir Putin bare-chested on horseback. Talking about the Philippines, how strong is the historical memory of the young Filipinos when it comes to young Marcos? Do they recall what his father did, or they do away with history and this is a guy to their liking?
I think what has happened is that because of the alternative information infrastructure that the Marcoses have built in social media, especially on YouTube, we recognize now that many people know about Marcos, even about his atrocities and his illegal wealth, but are ready to discount it. That is my own sense. I don't think that there is any Filipino who is not aware of the accusations against Marcos or the many cases against him. But I think there is a readiness now to just sort of discount it. We've heard that, which I think is actually very scary for us. Maybe I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. We'll continue that discussion later on with the audience as well. Mahfouz Anam, you're the wise man of journalism in Bangladesh, and you have seen strongmen in Asia come and go, and we look forward to your take.
Thank you very much. I see the rise of strong men in many parts of the world as a much bigger challenge, much bigger problem than perhaps it meets at the first stage. Now, after the Second World War, we have had some tremendous achievements. Democracy, free market, individual freedom, freedom of the press, democratic governance, rule-based governments in many parts of the world. And this is something we really must understand the value of. Democracy. I mean, of all the governments in the world, all the experiments done, this is the best we have so far. Free market, with all its flaws, has produced the biggest amount of wealth in human history. Decolonization was another great achievement in the post-Second World War. To me, the rise of the strong leadership is an antithesis to all this. A strong leader is primarily anti-democratic. He is nationalistic. He or she is populist. He or she tries to concentrate power in one hand. They are destroyers of institutions. They don't believe in institution-based governance. They don't believe in governance by law. They believe in governance by personal fiat. Now, so this is the contrast. So if you are talking about the rise of strong men, leaders all over the world, you have to see it in this bigger context, and thereby, in a way, formulate our strategy in that context. Now, are these strong leaders just good manipulators of the situation? Are they just good communicators? They are savvy, they are power hungry. Is it that? In my view, they are the product of some bigger failure. The bigger failures are failures of democracy. Now, West America, they were quite happy with their levels of democracy, but they are finding the cracks in their own democracies. The US is the biggest example. After 250 years of unbroken democracy, they are now embroiled into racism, white supremacy. They're embroiled into, I cannot believe that Republican Party, such a matured old party, 85% of Republicans believe that Biden's election was stolen. Now, please think of it. It's a rule-based country, free media, fact-based institutions, and this is the reality of the day. Now, in Europe, I think Europe is getting more and more overwhelmed by the fear of immigrants, and thereby they're electing leaders who are really contrary to European values, in my view. In our parts of the world, also, we are seeing the rise of very powerful leaders who are using the slogans of religion, slogans of ethnicity, slogans of whatever to accumulate power and perpetuate in power. China is an example by itself, which many people will talk. I will not go into that. Now, so how do we respond to this? I think we should examine where our democracies have failed, where our rule-based institutions have failed. Now, take one very big example. Free market has been the biggest engine of growth. But over the years, we have realized that free market has always also led to huge concentration of wealth. The world has never seen the type of concentration of wealth as we see now. 1% of world's population owning, I think, 35 or 40% of world's wealth, 40% of world's population owning only 1% of world's wealth. Now, these are stunning statistics, but underlying beneath these statistics are poor people, frustrated people, people who have seen, if you like, the world can achieve better, but they are not being given that opportunity. So this has, accumulated frustration is also leading to many, I would say, very unfortunate and unacceptable results into, religious bigotry, into racial bigotry, into all sorts of, tribalism in many parts of the world. All of this leading to distortion of democracy. Now, democracy, if you like, was based on a distribution of power, check and balance. The parliament looked over the executive was also, in a way, kept in chain by the judiciary, and there was a distribution of power. In many parts of the world, the judiciary, independence of judiciary is dwindling. Parliament has become nothing but a puppet of the executive, which is led by strong leaders. So this is the world. And this is the world in which Putin has invaded Ukraine. This is the world in which climate change is posing a serious threat. And this is the world where rich and poor gap is in the extreme. And this is the world that we need to fix. And in that case, I think this conference is a very, very timely one. So how do I see the future? In my view, whatever is left of the liberal forces all over the world, and I think there is significant amount of liberalism is still there in the world, we must coalesce. This strength has to be brought together. You know, as a student of history, I often wondered that how could enlightened Europe give birth to Nazism? How could Europe go into the First World War? And if you go back to the history, you will see, and there have been books written like this, that these countries literally sleepwalked into war. You know, didn't really take it seriously. Second World War also took Europe by surprise, but the rise of Nazism in the midst of enlightened Europe has always been, you know, a big question in my mind. But today, as I see the world and I see Putin invading, and I mean, also we must mention the invasion of the Middle East by the US in the name of preventing weapons of mass destruction was a total lie. So these, if you like, destructions of institutions, invasions of other countries have led to a cynicism that has to be seriously fought. And communication, to me, is one of the key elements in fighting that. So as I was suggesting, that a coalition of the liberal forces all over the world, I think a stronger voice for freedom of speech, freedom of the media, stronger voice of rule of law, governments respecting law, international law being more respected. This is what we need to actually concentrate on, in my view. But as I said, with the invasion of Ukraine by Putin, the world is getting divided. Now, who is right, who is wrong, definitely is a big question. I have absolutely no qualms in condemning Russia for the invasion. But how do we solve the problem? Now, the suspicion of China, what China will turn out to be, how dangerous it is as a country, I think is again another problem which has to be dealt with maturity and farsight. Now, some people find Chinese rise as a danger. We in Bangladesh didn't find Chinese rise as so much of a danger. We cooperate with China, we cooperate with India, and we move on ourselves as a developing country. But the reality is that the international economic system is still unfair. It is still extracting wealth from the developing world to the developed world. The extraction of wealth from Africa into Europe is still a present-day reality. So if we are going to build a world of better communication, a world of better, if you like, balance of prosperity, a balance of cooperation, then these fundamental issues will have to be addressed. Just looking at the rise of the strong leaders as a problem by itself, I think will lead us to incomplete solutions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mahfouz. To what extent in your analysis, when you look at strongmen in the region, does the charismatic strongman who also gives food and jobs have an advantage?
True. I mean, strong men, military dictatorships always come, they show more discipline, they show more, trains running on time, more food for the poor and things like that, but they really don't last. Strong leadership perhaps is like a balm to a wound. It is not a sustainable government. Democratic governments are the only possible sustainable governments, in my view.
Thanks very much. Over to Professor Sandeep Shastri of Jagran Lake City University. You come from the biggest democracy in the world, yet many people say you're being ruled by a strongman. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you for this opportunity, and it's a delight to be with this distinguished panel and this very knowledgeable audience. Yes, I would very much focus on India and the theme that this conference is talking about. And when talking about India, I would do it when we talk of the strong leader from two perspectives. The strong leader in context and the strong leader in contest. I think both are critical to look at. The context in which this strong leader emerges, the context in which the strong leader continues, and the nature of the political/electoral contest in which that leader takes things forward. This is a theme on which I have done some writing about, and therefore I will reflect on some of those points that I'd like to make. I'm going to divide my presentation into three parts. First, I'd like to look at the strong leader, continue some of the points which have been made in the dialogue till now, provide some data after that, and then draw certain conclusions. So 3 minutes for each of these is what I would like to give. Firstly, this whole question of, in the English language, when we say strong leader, and when I translate this into the 22 Indian languages which I use for doing the surveys in the country, the word strong often translates itself in Indian languages to terms which people perceive as something good in a leader. Strong is perceived as somebody who can deliver. Strong is perceived as somebody who can actually shake a system of its complacency and its inefficiency. That is the definition of a strong leader. And in the recent past, the debate on a strong leader in a many metaphorical sense has been on how wide is the chest of that leader to take on the responsibility of the country. So the larger context I'm trying to raise is, when I look at the emergence of a strong leader in India, and data says a majority of people consistently across surveys in the last 15 years in India have been saying, yes, we want a strong leader. And it is not seen as something necessarily anti-democratic. I'll add to this 2 points. India is famous for its festivals, but we also believe India is famous for the festival of elections, which constantly keeps happening in the country. We are a country which is constantly in election mode. You either have a federal election or you have a state election and you have a local election. And given the nature of 24/7 media, even if it is a local election, it gains national currency. Now, why is this important? When a nation is continuously and constantly in election mode, the result is leaders are always in the forefront. The strongman in India, our Prime Minister, if you do a study, at least 8 to 10 days in a month, he is often out campaigning. He is often out taking part in election rallies and speeches. So I think we also need to budget into the fact that the country is in a permanent election campaign mode. Because somewhere or the other, some election or the other is going on, and that is something that seems to impact the entire country. The third point before I go to data, I think there is also the strong lead, and I'm just not talking of one leader in India, the strong leaders who have emerged at the national and the state level in the country. The strong leaders have been, very importantly, the masters of the message. They have that great capacity to be able to turn around what their opponent says and make it in their favor. Last night, as I was waiting in the airport to take the flight here, I was to take part in a television debate. and the television debate was at 8 p.m. prime time India. And we were all waiting for the debate to begin. And there goes our debate, because the Prime Minister is giving a live speech at 8 p.m., which all networks then decide to telecast, and we are told your program is off the air. And this is not happening for the first time. And this is being done by all leaders, making sure that what they would like to say comes in during prime time and gathers attention. If my slides could go a little forward, there are 3 data points I wanted to show. If you could just take the next slide, move it a little further quickly. The next slide, please. Yes. Now, here is an example to show you that over a 20-year period of time, the leadership at the national level has had consistently between a 10 to 35 percentage point difference with the next person who is there in the race. A minimum of 10 percentage points, a maximum of 35 percentage points. My next slide would show you how could we move to the next slide, please? This slide would show you how the predicted probability for the national leader, I would want you to look at it over different dimensions. If you are socially privileged, if you are media savvy, if you are young, if you are well-to-do, the likelihood of your supporting the leadership is much high than the national average. And then I come to my third data point and then come to my conclusion. If you could go to the next slide. Why does that strong leader motivate voters to be able to get a party win the election? We had asked this question in the last 2 general elections to respondents. Would you have voted for the party of the leader if that leader was not the leader of the party? Would you have changed the way you voted if you had another leader? And it's interesting. In 2014, 1/4 of those who voted for the BJP said we would have changed the way we voted. And last time around, 1/3 said that they would have changed the way they voted. And look at also how the allies of the ruling party take a similar stand. So let me come to my final points, which I'd like to make. My final points, I will not make all the 5 points I've listed here. Maybe I would focus on 3. I think I go back to the point I began with, that we need to nuance the cultural context. We need to nuance the social context. In countries like India, when we use the word strong leader in Indian terminology, it is seen as something which is acceptable and something which the people desire. This strong leader, I come to my second point, not only brings in caste arithmetic and political chemistry, that strong leader also brings in what I would call leadership sociology. Be it Mr. Modi at the national level, be it a leader like Mamata Banerjee in West Bengal, or a leader in the state I live in today, Shivraj Singh in Madhya Pradesh. Now, they are able to do this interesting combination. And my final 2 points. In public perception, the strong leader, and there is data to show this, is able to win an election at the federal and state level, is able to win an election if the citizen perceives governance on the ground. And there is data to prove this point, that the strong leader whose actions in governance have shown progress at the ground level has actually been able to come back to power. And my last point, which is both for me a challenge as well as a question of debate. Leaders have made this point. Do people see my intentions in what I do as pure and not necessarily what I deliver as being necessarily great? In Indian languages, there is a term, people think my intentions are pure and that's enough for me to win an election. The strong man, the strong leader, India has seen a cycle. The rise of the strong leader, the inability to sustain, resulting in that strong leader having to make way for someone else. I would stop there and thank you for the time you gave me.
Thanks very much, Professor. I think there is also a lot of debate when we talk about strongmen, about the gap between message and reality. And if in your country the Prime Minister is in a constant election campaign, this gap probably becomes wider and wider in people's perception. Would you agree to that?
Yes, and I think this is also going to be the issue of debate tomorrow. On the question of whether the strong leader in terms of perception and reality, I think depends on, where you stand depends on where you sit. The question we are going to raise tomorrow as part of our debate of the nature of intense polarization that you see in society. I remember jokingly saying in 2019 when the election happened, the Prime Minister's slogan was, "Good days are coming." And my question was, do you add a question mark or an exclamation mark after that statement? So I think it depends on which side of the ring are you in terms of how you look at it. So yes, the perception versus the performance, the rhetoric versus the reality. I think the strong leader's capacity, and I'm talking of both at the national and state level in India, the strong leader's capacity is to be able to place the rhetoric in a particular language which is attractive to the masses, and then 5 years down the line when another election comes, try to explain to the voter as to what happened in terms of reality. And I think that mastering the way in which the message is presented, I think has been one of the strengths of the strong leaders, both at the national and the state level.
Thank you very much. We are talking about strongmen up here on stage. So far, only men have been talking. And therefore, I am very glad that Stephanie Bolson is with us. She's a longtime correspondent for the German daily Die Welt. She was based in Brussels and is now based in the United Kingdom. Over to you, Stephanie.
Thank you, and I might even be able to talk about a strong woman in what I'm talking about now. But first of all, thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much to Konrad Adenauer Stiftung and to you, of course, Ansgar, for inviting me. And I will try to shed a bit of a light on Europe, not so much from academic perspective, but being a simple reporter, reporting in a kind of triangle between London, Brussels, and Berlin. And when we talk about Europe, it's kind of strongman Europe. Is that associated? But of course it is. Of course, different degrees, very different nuances. But I would like to, in this context, name 3 politicians, very high-ranking politicians, which you might want to call strongmen. Some that have been on the scene for quite a long time, like Hungary's Viktor Orban. He is in fact, now that Angela Merkel resigned, the longest-serving prime minister in Europe. He came to power in 2010. There are others. One is especially known and popular to a degree also in this part of the world, who's Boris Johnson, who I was privileged to report on very closely for quite a long time. He resigned back in July, but as he said in the House of Commons, hasta la vista, baby. So as Terminator, sooner or later, I think he will be back. And talking about strong women, we just had the election of Giorgia Meloni in Italy, although I will be very cautious to call her a strong woman, because we are only seeing her emerge and we are only seeing her government coalition being formed. Now, while I think that Europe generally remains a bastion for the defense of liberal values, an increasing number of countries experience a leadership that, in very individual ways, challenge the system. So if you take the 3 examples, Orban, Johnson, and Meloni, they have one thing in common. They are very charismatic. And second, their citizens, the countries have gone through years, and in case I think of Italy, you can rightly say of decades of mismanagement. And populations and people who experience a growing discontent, they cry out for quick and simple solutions. And I can testify that because I covered the Brexit referendum back in 2016. Still, and I think that's really important to say, there are mechanisms at play that work as a corrective, as we say in German, or in English you would say checks and balances. And they put limits to Europe's strongmen or strongwomen. So take, for example, Viktor Orban. He's currently, as ever, trying to get a deal with Brussels. Having been a Brussels correspondent and having attended I don't know how many councils, one thing I learned is that Brussels is a bazaar. So there's always deals until late in the night and everybody comes out as a winner somehow. So the European Commission has frozen currently 13 billion euro in subsidies, which Orban urgently needs. It's around 15% of his annual budget. And the EU Commission froze these subsidies because of Hungary's lack of fight against corruption and breaches of rule of law principles. At the same time, as we know, because of the situation in Ukraine, there is a lot of uncertainty how unified the approach by the European Union will be going forward in terms of sanctions against Russia and Vladimir Putin. So there might be a trade-off now around Hungary's breaches of the rule of law. And that might, looking at the atrocities being committed in Ukraine, a kind of cynical approach, but it shows the leverage the EU has and how these things work. Now let's go back to the example of Boris Johnson, which I know best because of covering British politics. When he became Prime Minister in July 2019 after the leadership contest, so before the election, he stood in front of Downing Street number 10, in front of the famous Black Door, and he said he will make Britain the greatest place on earth again. Make Britain great again, it sounds familiar. Once a strongman claims to be the only leader capable of restoring national greatness, the basis is created for undermining independent institutions that might stand in the way of this vital task. In particular, the courts, the media, and the constitution. Well, in Britain, a bit more difficult not having a constitution, but it's possible. So let's look at Britain again. And September 2019, shortly after Johnson came to power, when he tried to prorogate Parliament. At the same time, there were other factors, like the British government, in a subtle way, starting a campaign against the BBC, introducing laws that curtail the freedom of assembly, and so on. But it must be said, like in the case of Hungary, Johnson's attempts of concentrating power in Downing Street were stopped. The Supreme Court declared the prorogation unlawful. That was the first in British history. But then Johnson, also because of his character, lost the confidence of country and parliament during the so-called party scandal, when parties were held in Downing Street during COVID lockdown. I'm sure Tony would discuss whether that was necessary, but we might have this conversation later. But the pressure grew by the public because people were stuck at home and didn't accept that the Prime Minister, or not the Prime Minister, but rather his staff, was not sticking to the rules while being inside number 10. Also, there was an investigation by the Privileged Committee due if the Prime Minister, in fact, had misled Parliament. And then the 6th and 7th of July came, and I can really tell you this were some extraordinary days. I was running between Downing Street and the corridors of Portcullis House and Parliament, and no one knew what was going to happen because the pressure was growing. Rishi Sunak had resigned, and Sajid Javid had resigned. There was enormous pressure. Still, Boris Johnson kept on reshuffling his cabinet. He wouldn't come out of number 10. Michael Gove went in, Nadim Zahawi. So the most powerful and influential politicians went in and said, Prime Minister, time is up, and he still wouldn't go. In the end, he did go, and we now have a new Prime Minister in Britain. So it must be said, though, that while there are limits to Europe's strongman latitude, what is permanent is the narrative, them against us. And this narrative is not going away. I attended the Conservative Party conference last week in Birmingham, and the new British Prime Minister Liz Truss, she talked about people, quote, who take a taxi from North London townhouses to the BBC studio to dismiss anyone challenging the status quo. it is this narrative of the normal, decent people against the establishment, which one hears increasingly in all parts of Europe, including in Germany. And that narrative of them against us will only get louder now that Europe is facing so many challenges at the same time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Would you say, because we haven't been talking about that extensively here on the panel yet, when it comes to the question, how do we address the strongmen? How resilient are our respective societies? By your observation of the British society and British institutions, did they show this resilience against the strongmen?
Yeah, they have definitely shown resilience. Whether it was the case of the Supreme Court, whether it's especially Parliament. I mean, the Prime Minister, as by the way, the King, is only King by the allowance, the permission of Parliament. I was actually in the House of Commons after the Queen died, and King Charles came in to declare his loyalty or his almost obedience to Parliament, to both House of Lords and House of Commons. And you saw how this very old democracy, how the mechanisms kick in. So I do think that in the case of Britain, the institutions do work, but at the same time you see that they can be corroded and that they can be influenced.
Thank you very much. I know that we are running behind schedule, but with the consent of our organizers, we would continue discussing with the audience a couple of minutes longer. Are there any questions and comments? We would like to collect those and then answer them and react to them collectively here on stage. There's one gentleman over there. You could use this microphone in the corridor. Are there any more? Yes, Anja Graf is the second one, and yeah, we take these two for the time being. If you please could briefly introduce yourself, say who you are, and whether your question or comment is addressed to anyone in particular or us up here in general.
Yeah, Andreas Klein, Director of the Political Dialogue Program of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation based here in Singapore. And the question is like an open question. Whoever wants to answer is, of course, invited to answer. I mean, as we are having so many representatives of media here in the hall and on the panel, I would be interested in how you see the role of the media in the reign, but also especially in the rise of strong men or women. And also you were addressing the role of the institutions and how institutions try to control those strong men, women, and in some cases are not able to control them. So how do you see the role of the media? I mean, we don't have to mention Trump and his connection to Fox News and Breitbart News. Marcos used the social media very well, almost like uncontrollable instrument and tool. Berlusconi, we haven't addressed him, but that was already like 20 or more years ago with his media empire. Now another figure which is not so much involved in politics yet, but with Elon Musk, trying to get hands on Twitter, he might be becoming also like a political strongman in the future, controlling this mass media. So I would be interested how you see it in order to, how you see the role of media in order to control those strong men and women. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Andreas Klein and Anja Graf, please.
Yeah, thank you. You already introduced me. My name is Anja Graf, and I do have one remark. First of all, what jumped into my head when I heard your different discussion contributions, I think there's a need to distinguish between strong man or a strong woman and strong leadership. I think the one is something that might be a danger for democracy because it's trying to corrode democratic institutions, media presence, and strong leadership, in contrast, to my opinion, is something positive. So that there are people who are capable, who are willing to take decisions, who are willing to lead teams, to integrate different opinions, and at the end to bring together different points of views and then decide. So I think in terminology, it might be good to distinguish between both of it. So this was my first remark. And the second thing is, Mr. Ananyo referred to the development of wealth distribution in the world. So I think there was always financial inequality and social inequality in the world. What's not really the point of the problem? I think the problem is if societies become or lose their permeability, so that people are taken their hopes, their perspectives, to be able to make their careers, to change their status in life, to proceed and to be successful in life. I think this is a real problem, is if this is taken from people. So let me just say some small anecdote we encountered when we have been to the United States. That one day we sat in a taxi, and it was a situation where just tax cuts for the wealthy were planned. And we talked to the taxi driver and said, yeah, what do you think about this? And the taxi driver said, yes, it's okay. And when we asked, yeah, but why? You don't benefit from those tax cuts because it's only for the wealthy ones. And he said, you know, maybe one day I belong to this group of the wealthy ones, and then I benefit from those tax cuts as well. So, and the message behind was, okay, there is a chance for me. I can do my way and do my career. And I think this is important, that societies keep this permeability for their people. And there's also the role of media to highlight this point and not to take more regulation, but foster the liberal societies. So this was my comment.
Thank you very much. People's aspirations and people's hopes is certainly something that many strongmen play very artistically with. We still have a participant who's with us from Hong Kong. Professor, would you like to join in and maybe take the last question? And then I would appeal to our media colleagues up here to refer to the first question, the role of the media in glorifying or criticizing strongmen.
Sorry, can you remind me the last question?
The term was the permeability of society. You know, can people move? Yes. Can people move in the strata of society?
Yes. What I would say regarding China is that Xi Jinping himself still enjoys a lot of support in society. But when you go to mainland China, of course, the support is stronger among middle-aged people, old people, people living in second-tier, third-tier cities. But at the same time, I see more criticism or reservation among both the elite, or some segments of the elite, and also among the young people in China. So it doesn't mean that they want more, they want a regime change. I think it's far-fetched. I think China has been used to have a strong man for more than 2,000 years. The comparison with the Huangdi, with the emperor, is permanent in China. So Xi Jinping, and there's a lot of sarcasm about, Xi Jinping who wanted to be a modern emperor. But at the same time, I don't see enough momentum or consensus in the society to really criticize strongman politics heads on. They feel, by and large, most people still feel safer with a strongman than without a strongman. But of course, we have to wait and see and stay tuned, because Chinese society is also Chinese society, which is changing very quickly. And the COVID-19 pandemic, the so-called dynamic zero COVID policy, has also affected Xi Jinping, negatively affected Xi Jinping's image in the country. And so people are getting more critical of him than was the case 10 years ago.
Professor Shastri, the hopes and aspirations of a highly divided society like yours, with a very strong caste system where it is difficult to move?
Quick responses. One, on this whole question of the term we are using, strongman, I think we need to understand the cultural context and interrogate that term in the context of how different societies, especially in some of the Asian societies, the term has totally different ways of people resonating with it. Secondly, on the last point about the taxi driver's example of my time will come, let me share another example from the Indian context which was similar, where people were being told that you have to tighten your belt for a brief period of time and you will also see the golden day. And one man stood up and said, it's fine to tighten the belt, but first give me a trouser so that I can tighten the belt. Without the trouser, which belt do you want me to tighten? So I think there is that dimension also, that how long will people wait for that hope of a dividend which is going to come? And I think there is an element of a democratic deficit which comes in with that.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask finally our three journalists here on the panel and media experts to respond to the question as to what extent does media play its role in scrutinizing the strongman? John.
Yes, thank you. Three quick responses. I'd like to actually answer both questions, and I relate it to something that we just heard again from Sandeep, which is that the term strongman can be confusing, even as used technically. I completely agree with you that the strength is a quality that we associate as a positive asset of leaders. Perhaps we won't use the term strongman, but that's precisely what makes strongmen, understood technically, dangerous. They seize on this cultural affinity for strength and run away with it, right? Which brings me to the question about the role of the media. And I think that far too often the media can be gamed. Strong men can use their rise as a kind of bait for journalists, especially journalists like us who are obsessed with story rather than audience. So when we chase the story, sometimes we are not aware that we are, to use your word, glorifying someone who turns out to be a fascist ruler. I mean, I remember now, so we did not know who Meloni was, but I think the first story, one of the first stories that ran internationally after she became, or her party made her prime minister of Italy was, look at this, how this young girl was bullied in school and now she's prime minister. Instead of like, hey, look at this fascist who has taken over Mussolini's party. And as Tony Abbott says, we should believe what dictators and authoritarians tell us. And yet the story was, wow, look at this little girl. She was bullied and now she's the new prime minister. It's very easy for us to get confused, chasing after stories and not looking at the big picture, as Mahfouz says. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Mahfouz.
Well, I think like the rest of the world's institutions, journalism and journalists need to reflect, to introspect. In many ways, I think we have lost our way, moved away from our ethical missions. In many ways, we are doing better than before, but we really need to introspect that are we serving the society that was supposed to be? And the reason is why I will mention, media freedom is one of the very few rights which are incorporated in the constitutions of democratic countries. They talk about freedom of the judiciary and they talk about the freedom of the media. They don't talk about freedom of doctors or engineers or lawyers. They talk about these two professions and why. Experience have proven that judiciary keeps the executive in check. Media, by its own watchdog role, keeps the executive and other institutions in check. And that is why the Constitution gives us special privileged position. And because of that, we journalists need to be more responsible, more accountable to the society which has given us this privilege.
Thank you very much, Mahfouz. And finally, Stephanie, please.
Just a quick thought about Andreas' question. If you take Viktor Orban, I mean, one of the reasons why Viktor Orban has been in power for so long is also that the media freedom in Hungary is severely damaged over the 12 years that he has been in power. And I remember, I think just before the pandemic, I attended a conference, I think near Vienna, and there were some Hungarian journalists, and I asked them a bit naive question. I said, so when was it worse to work as a journalist, during the Cold War or now? And they said, now. Now it's much worse because there's so much pressure and there's so much threats against journalists in Hungary, and a lot of them had to leave the media or talk about Turkey. I mean, I just was in Turkey at a conference and was sitting at the table with a Turkish journalist who spent a year in prison. So, but when it comes to media as such, especially in Britain, it is very divided. There are many mornings that I'm just tired at looking at the front pages of British media because you have really day and night every morning. And it was interesting to follow the coverage of the so-called party scandal. And again, make of it what you will. But in the end, Boris Johnson had to resign. But it was kicked off by the Mirror, which is clearly not a pro-government or pro-Tory newspaper. But then, to be fair, it was then very much picked up by the Telegraph and the Times. The further the scandal and the more evidence came out about what was going on in Downing Street. So in that case, of course, the media in Britain did its job. But I do think because of economic pressures and because we know what our readers like to read, I do think that in Europe, media increasingly feeds their audiences and by doing so also contributes to dividing society.
Thank you very much. I think we will have ample opportunity to also discuss the opportunities of developing stronger resilience in our respective societies, of introspecting the approach of politicians and journalists when it comes to strongmen. And I think we will also be having possibilities to discuss the role of social media, not only to liberate people, but also to promote the fear-mongering of strongmen and to amplify their simplistic messages and their noise. I think we have to realize that these loud messages are going to stay, and that is one of the challenges for political communication. How to promote the calmer message, the more thoughtful idea that is not echoed by loudspeakers all over the place. I would like to thank all participants and you, the audience, for your contributions and listening attentively. Strongmen come and go, but societies need to develop more resilience. And finally, let us not believe that the strongmen that we are faced with in our respective country is the only strongman. These experiences are quite universal, and in many countries all over the world, also on the continent where I live at the moment, we face the bullying strongman. It's a global phenomenon, and we can only counter it by developing this political resilience of democratic institutions and of society. I thank you all, and I now would like to announce, Glenn, you have to confirm that, please, that there will be a 15-minute coffee break. Is that all right, Glenn? Until noon, until midday. And then at 12 o'clock, the conference will separate into 2 breakout rooms. This room will host a session on balancing free speech and political correctness on social media, moderated by our colleague Katharina Naumann, while room B, next door, will host a session on election campaigning in times of crisis, moderated by Ray Padit. And the conference hashtag is #ACPC22. Thank you, and see you again at midday. Thank you very much.